The stadium buzzed with excitement, but for 83-year-old Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, it was meant to be a quiet moment of pride, a promise fulfilled. Dressed in his best blazer and gripping a printed e-ticket his grandson had mailed him, Elias had made the long journey to witness David Thorne, a rising college football star, play in the most important game of his career. Elias, a decorated Veter, when Elias reached Section 102, reserved seating for players' families, his ticket wouldn't scan. A young usher, clearly overwhelmed, referred him to security. That's when things took a turn. A supervisor named Henderson, dismissive and impatient, barely glanced at the ticket before accusing Elias of trying to sneak in. "You don't look like VIP family," he said with a sneer. Elias tried to explain his grandson was the starting quarterback, and he had the right seat, but it was no use. The guards didn't see a veteran or a grandfather. Despite his calm pleas, two large security guards grabbed his arms and escorted him away, past the confused and pitying stares of other fans. His heart sank, not because he was removed, but because he'd promised David he'd be there. Humiliated, he sat alone on a bench outside the stadium, clutching his cap and wondering how things had gone so wrong. The ticket may not have scanned, but Elias Thorne's worth was never in question. Not for his family, not for his country. Elias Thorne had never asked for special treatment. The 83-year-old veteran had faced battlefields, buried comrades, and built a quiet life of integrity after returning from decades of military service. But nothing had prepared him for the sheer humiliation he felt as two uniformed stadium guards dragged him out of Section 102, his grandson's section, while thousands of fans watched in confused silence. He wasn't resisting, wasn't even raising his voice. All he wanted was to watch David play the championship game, just like he promised when David was a boy. His ticket hadn't scanned, and the supervisor, Henderson, hadn't given him a chance to explain. When Elias mentioned David Thorne, his grandson, the quarterback, the man laughed in his face. "Yeah, everyone's the quarterback's grandpa today," he had scoffed. No matter what Elias said, he was treated like a nuisance, a fraud, a burden. That moment as the guards forced him up the aisle was burned into his memory. The judgmental eyes, the smirks, the pity from strangers. His shoulders, once squared in Marine formations, sagged under the weight of shame. His cap, the old ball cap he'd worn to every one of David's games, nearly fell to the ground. He caught it just in time and clutched it like a lifeline. Outside the stadium, Elias sat on a cold concrete bench. The muffled roar of the crowd inside was a cruel reminder of what he was missing. He tried to compose himself, to figure out how to call David after the game without sounding like he'd been tossed out like trash. His only hope had been a desperate plea to a guard, mentioning the name of General Alistair Hammond, a man he'd once served beside in a forgotten corner of the world. It had seemed hopeless, until everything changed. Inside the stadium, a woman who had overheard Elias's plea had made a call, one that reached higher than anyone imagined. Within minutes, the stadium's energy shifted. The crowd's cheer faded to confusion, then complete silence. The Jumbotron blinked with a startling announcement. "Game delayed, official statement pending." Then came a voice, firm, commanding, unmistakable. "This is General Alistair Hammond." Elias froze, his heart skipped. That voice, he'd know it anywhere. The general's words thundered through the stadium, calling out the inn. At that moment, Elias wasn't just an old man with a crumpled ticket. He was a veteran, a grandfather, a man whose sacrifices were finally unmissed. Just as Elias Thorne sat on a cold concrete bench outside the stadium, staring blankly at the roaring arena that now echoed with the sound of everything he was missing, fate intervened in a most unexpected way. Inside the stadium, fans and players alike were caught off guard as the massive Jumbotron abruptly shifted from game coverage to a simple, bold message. "Game delayed, official announcement pending." Confused murmurs swirled like wind through the stands. Then, as silence fell across the field, a commanding voice rose through the PA system. Clear, steady, unmistakably military. "Attention, please." The name alone stopped conversation mid-sentence. Players froze, coaches turned, and even the referees stood at attention. Up in the VIP box, General Hammond, "It has come to my attention," he said, voice echoing with power and fury, that Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, a decorated combat veteran and the grandfather of our starting quarterback, was wrongly and disrespectfully removed from his rightful seat by stadium security. This action is an affront not just to Mr. Thorne, but to every American who has ever served. In that instant, the air inside the stadium changed. Shock rippled through the crowd. People looked around in disbelief. Was this really happening? Then came the directive that would go down. "This game will not continue," Hammond declared, "until Sergeant Major Thorne is located, personally apologized to by stadium officials, and escorted back to his seat in Section 102 with full respect and dignity. Any personnel responsible?" Outside, Elias, still unaware of the storm brewing inside. Before Elias could answer, Elias, visibly moved, nodded humbly and accepted the Chancellor's offered Sergeant Major. He said, voice steady, "You belong here, and this entire stadium stands with you." The ovation grew louder, sustained and thunderous. David Thorne, on the field in full gear, raised as he returned to his rightful seat in Section 102. Elias's heart, heavy just minutes before, albeit with so. The atmosphere inside the stadium was electric, but not with the usual buzz of a championship game. Instead, it carried the weight of accountability, honor, and long overdue justice. As Sergeant Major Elias Thorne took his seat once again in Section 102, the very air seemed to shift. The man who had been humiliated and dismissed was now seated with reverence and admiration, surrounded by a sea of supportive fans and dignitaries. General Hammond remained at his side, a visible symbol of solidarity. The message was clear. No one would be allowed to dishonor a veteran without facing the consequences. The university wasted no time addressing the situation. The two security guards who had forcibly removed Elias were formally dismissed from duty before the crowd. Their earpieces were taken, badges removed, and they were quietly escorted out by senior staff. The head of stadium security, Henderson, stood before the university chancellor, his face pale and drawn. He attempted to explain, citing a ticketing mix-up, but the chancellor cut him off with a single gesture. "You humiliated a decorated Marine in front of thousands," the chancellor said, voice low but resolute. "You failed to verify his credentials and ignored his dignity. That is not the kind of leadership we need here." Henderson was suspended indefinitely, pending a full investigation into the incident and broader security training practices. Meanwhile, the university issued a public statement acknowledging the error and vowing to reform procedures to ensure no such mistake would ever happen again. A dedicated liaison was appointed to oversee veteran accommodations at all future events, and a new code of conduct was circulated among staff and volunteers. As for Elias, his presence had become a symbol. During halftime, he was invited to midfield where General Hammond addressed the crowd once more, this time standing beside Elias. The Jumbotron lit up with photos from Elias's time in service, grainy images of a young soldier in uniform, medals gleaming, standing proud among his comrades. The announcer recited his accomplishments: 3 decades in uniform, a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and countless missions completed without recognition. "Let this man be known," Hammond declared, "not just for what he endured today, but for what he gave this country over a lifetime." The crowd erupted again, rising to its feet in sustained applause. David Thorne, watching from the sidelines, wiped tears from his eyes and waved toward his grandfather. For Elias, the moment was surreal. He hadn't expected recognition. He had never asked for applause. All he had wanted was to sit quietly, watch his grandson play, and uphold a promise made long ago. But now, his story had touched thousands. Journalists in the press box were already writing headlines about the event. Social media was flooded with tributes to the quiet Marine who stopped the game. The rest of the match was played with a new sense of purpose. The Titans dominated the second half, David Thorne throwing a record number of touchdown passes, his eyes frequently glancing towards Section 102. Each time they connected, Elias would smile and give a small, knowing nod. After the final whistle, which sealed a historic victory for the Titans, the team gathered near the stands. David climbed into the section, pushing through the crowd until he reached his grandfather. The two embraced, a long and emotional hug that drew that drew applause from everyone nearby. "You did it," Elias said, voice cracking. "We did it, Grandpa," David replied. "This was for you." In the days that followed, the story spread across the country. News outlets aired clips of the game delay, Hammond's announcement, and the ovation. Veterans groups across the nation praised the university's handling of the aftermath and called for similar respect at all public events. Elias Thorne, once just a quiet grandfather, was now a symbol of resilience and dignity. He returned home not with bitterness, but with renewed hope. Hope that the world still recognized honor, still respected sacrifice, and still understood what it meant to truly serve. And in that recognition, Elias found peace. The game had resumed, the final score recorded, but what would be remembered far longer than any play on the field was the moment one man's quiet presence demanded a nation to pause and listen. As the final whistle blew and the crowd erupted in cheers for the Titans' championship win, Elias Thorne remained seated in Section 102, his heart full, his eyes moist. Around him, fans stood not just for the victory, but for him. What had started as a moment of General Hammond sat beside Elias, not as a four-star commander, but as a friend. He leaned in and said, "You didn't just see your grandson win today. You reminded this whole stadium what real dignity looks like." Elias, overwhelmed, simply nodded, the old baseball cap still clutched over his heart. After the game, David found his grandfather at midfield. With the university, shamed by what had nearly trend in the weeks that followed, a bronze plaque was placed on Seat 7, Row C, Section 102. It read, "Reserved in honor of Sergeant Major Elias Jones." In a world moving too fast, it's easy to overlook the quote. Let this story remind us that real strength it endures. And sometimes the softest voices carry the most powerful truth. If this story moved you, comment "Honor Always" below and share your thoughts or stories about a hero in your life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that restore your faith.